Today we're going to look at this Commodore 64C. When I initially saw this one, they wanted $100 for it. And as you're getting ready to see here in just a second, I thought that was a little much. The box has obviously been wet. No idea if the machine got wet. It's pretty disgusting. And if you can look over here, it's missing a key. It's probably the yellowest 64C I've seen probably ever. So, yeah, it's just gross. What we're going to do is get this guy 100% back and operational, hopefully looking as good as new. I have no idea what we're getting into, but it ought to be fun. I'd like to give each project that I work on a name, so we're going to call this one the Yellow Beast. The first goal for the Yellow Beast is going to be to do something about the yellow, restore this color as close as we can back to the original factory color. The second goal is going to be to fix the broken key, and then our third and final goal is to make sure that when everything is 100% operational when we're finished. Really what I would like to do is take this machine in the condition that you've seen it and try to get it back to as close, at least as close as I can, back to what it looked like in 1986 when these were first released. We're not going to do any modifications, any custom circuitry or anything like that on this one. I've got some videos coming up here in the future where we're going to make some mods, both community mods that you see on the internet and then also some custom mods and custom circuitry to make these things do what we want them to do. But this one is going to be purely back to factory original, or at least as close as we can get. Just to give you an idea how yellow this is, I'm going to put this next to one of my 128s. This is one of my game machines, one I use for lots of playthings, and there you go. Hopefully that shows up nice. We're going to get this, hopefully, looking more like this. One thing that's a little bit hard to see on camera here is just the amount of crud that's underneath the keys on this keyboard. So I think the next step really is to turn this thing on and let's see if it works. Alright, let's fire this Yellow Beast up and see what happens. Blue screen, flashing cursor, correct amount of RAM. I think we're in business. Keyboard seems to operate. Function keys, they won't throw anything on the screen. You'll see the cursor kind of flash as I'm pushing them. So those are all good. Shift to get the odd numbers, those are good. Non-mask or interrupt by hitting the restore key. So run, stop, restore should blank the screen. Looks good. I think we may have something operational here. While everything seems to work well with the basic testing we've done thus far, one thing I did notice was the current draw. Right now we're drawing about 1.15 amps. That is a bit higher than what I typically see from a 64C. That could be okay. It also could be a sign that one of the ICs are bad, or a component inside is bad, or is going bad. So that's something we want to keep an eye on, do a little bit more testing, but that is a little higher than I would like to see. Alright, I'm going to be honest, every time I touch this thing, I feel like I need to go wash my hands. That could be just everything that's going on nowadays, or it could just be this thing is grimy and utterly disgusting. So we're going to play it safe. These are pretty easy to take apart. Oh my goodness. There you go. Get you a little bit more of an idea how bad this thing is yellowed. This is supposed to look something like this. Wow. It's also got Torx head screws. Kind of forgot about that. Let me switch screwdrivers and let's see what we can do. Okay, there's always a little trick to get these guys out of there. It's a tight, snug fit, assuming I got all the screws out, which it looks like I did. There we go. Ooh, now that's interesting. Look at this. So, I'm going to say this guy has been wet. What you're seeing there, and definitely what you see there, look to me, looks like water. Luckily, that shield right there kept that away from the board, and we will pull this off here shortly. Get a look at the underside, and we'll see how she looks. But so far, not horrible. I kind of expected this. Kind of looks like a whale. Maybe that's his eye. Hump. Ah, interesting. Yes. Coming off on my fingers. Okay, and now time for one of the fun parts. As you can see, this keyboard is gross. And so, using this handy dandy keycap puller, we're going to pull off all the keycaps and clean them. What I like to do when I'm working on these is I like to completely disassemble everything, clean it from one end to the other, partially because it's OCD, probably, and the other part is once it's clean and you've started from the ground up with everything spick and span, it seems to work a lot better. One of the tricks I've learned about using this guy right here, rather than go on, I'll show you this way, rather than go on like this, I find it better to kind of go at an angle and grab the corners of the key. So when you grab the corners of the key, let's see if we can focus, like this, it works a lot better. I think it comes off easier. You're kind of coming at it like this, rather than like this. Don't know exactly why, but it just seems to work better for me. So that's what I'm going to do. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to soak this stuff, probably soak it overnight, and then tomorrow come back and see how much crud has come off. And then this guy. And just so you can get a good view how disgusting this really is. And again, one of the grosser ones I've seen. When we're done, it won't look anything like this. We've got the keys soaking in some 409 and hot water. We'll let these sit overnight and come back tomorrow, and hopefully most of the dirt will be gone. The next thing we're going to do is get this keyboard cleaned up. I'm really not 100% sure what it is growing on there, but I know enough to turn it over and not try to breathe it in. So we're going to take out all of these screws, take this completely apart, clean the circuit board, get the plungers out, and see if we can get this keyboard looking a little bit better. There's a lot of screws. This is going to take a little bit of time, so I will spare everyone the boredom of watching me do all of this and get to the part where we try to get the hair off this thing. This is going to be pretty satisfying, so we're going to have to share. So there is a lot of stuff coming off of this. Yeah, it's pretty gross. Just this right here is going to make a big difference. Certainly makes me feel better. And honestly, it's going to make it work a little bit better. Those plungers are a pretty tight fit. And a plunger that sticks is annoying, to say the least. So getting all this crud out of the way means there's going to be less chance of that happening. Now, when you're done with this, it's going to need to dry pretty good. It's going to work a lot better if it's not wet when you put it back together. So, once I'm done, I'm going to set it aside. We're going to let it dry and put it back together probably tomorrow. One thing that I'm not going to do is I'm not going to rush. I'm not in a hurry. I've got plenty of projects to keep me busy. And so I don't need to finish this in a day or two. But I do like it to be done right when I'm done. So I'm going to let it dry, and I'll let it dry for a while. I got a couple tricks to kind of speed that up if I need to. It's really hard sometimes to get water out of every nook and cranny, especially on some of these things. And I'm not going to really scrub down in here. It really doesn't look like it needs. It's pretty clean. As you'll recall, that circuit board was there. There's a few holes here where the little tabs for the spacebar go in and out. Crud can get down in there, so I'm definitely going to scrub that. But beyond that, not really necessary to get all crazy with the brush and the 409. Certainly it's going to be wet. We'll look right. But that be as it may. Alright. So that looks a million times better already. And I probably can't get a good look at it, but it's not growing hair. There's no fur on it anymore. And that is a lot better. Ta-da! At this point, it's time to rinse all the 409 off, rinse the keycaps off one last time, wipe them down, and set them out to let them dry. This is going to take a little bit. There's a lot of keys. Once these are dry, we're going to start the Retrobright, and while that's happening, we'll get started on the bottom of the case and the whale stain that we saw a little bit earlier. The next step here is to try to get this plastic as clean as possible. When retrobrighting, if there's anything stuck to the plastic, adhesives, dirt, hair, in the case of this yellow beast, it's not going to come out as well as if it was clean. Obviously that stuff gets in the way of the lights, and you won't get a good finish out of it. So getting this thing clean is going to be really important. We're going to try to get the whale off. 409 sometimes does a really good job, since this is probably more iron based on the color. May not work as well. In the case that 409 doesn't do it, then I will go to the baking soda route. There's been a lot of folks on the internet and YouTube that have done that. It really does work really well. A good amount of baking soda, touch of water, and a toothbrush. I'm pretty confident that will take care of it. But I really want to get everything clean. The top shell, the bottom shell, as clean as we can get. All the adhesive off, as you remember the stickers on the top. Get it really clean, really dry, and then we'll go to the Retrobright and see how that process works on something that's turned this yellow. Like other people on the internet, my Retrobright process has evolved over the years. First of all, I use some fairly high-powered ultraviolet light. I've got these two here off of Amazon. I will put the link below. I believe there's some other folks that use these as well. I believe they're about 60 watts. They're pretty powerful, and I have two of them. I try to hit every piece that I'm doing from multiple angles. Instead of putting the items in a bath of water and then adding, the hydrogen peroxide to that, what I use is this cream. Basically, it's the same stuff at Salon Care, 40 volume, but I get the cream, and then what I do is take the piece and either wrap it in Saran wrap or put it in a large Ziploc type bag. I get mine from IKEA because they're cheap, and I can reuse them many times. But essentially then I will take the cream and basically rub it all over the item. The plastic, the Saran wrap or the Ziploc bag is generally just to keep it from drying up or evaporating, and allows me to do it without a huge smell. My workroom is in the basement, so I try to keep the smells to a minimum if at all possible. But essentially I will put that under the light and then rotate the items. The one downside to this is sometimes the distribution of hydrogen peroxide cream is not necessarily uniform as it would be if it was in solution, or if you were to put hydrogen peroxide in water and submerge the item. So I have to come every little bit and massage and sort of rub the cream around. I've had pretty good luck with this, to be honest. The first time I did it, I didn't rub the cream around and ended up with a very inconsistent finish. But as long as I come back every 15 or 20 minutes and basically just run my fingers over the item, I tend to get a fairly good result from it. So with these lights, it does not take very long. Typically, I can take an item that's got some yellowing to it, and within an hour, maybe 2, 3 at the absolute most, I can get it right back to the original color. So this one is so yellow, I'm not sure that that's going to work that way, but that's basically what my process looks like. While the plastic pieces are cooking in the ultraviolet light, want to go back to the keyboard here. So essentially what I'm going to do is clean this keyboard really good with some alcohol. I like to use these little alcohol preps that you can buy at pretty much any store. It's just easy to clean with these, and I can throw them away when I'm done. The one thing that we're going to find here is that I'm missing a plunger. The key that's broken was actually in the box, and after pulling the head of the plunger out of the back of the key, what I need is a plunger. Now, I have a fairly extensive spare parts bin, but for this, I really didn't want to go to that. I want to 3D print one. These parts are obviously harder and harder to come by, and I think it would be really neat to get a good 3D model that I could use for a keyboard plunger. So off to Thingiverse I went, and I will put a link below on the model that I used, and I'm going to 3D print one. So as soon as I'm done getting all these pieces and parts back together, I will go to the 3D printer and make my own plunger. So for my 3D printing, I use Tinkercad. It's free online software, and it seems to do a decent enough job. This model I downloaded from Thingiverse. Again, the link to the original will be below. The problem that I had was either the model wasn't quite right, there may have been some differences in keycaps and plungers for Commodore throughout the years. I certainly know they did make different style keyboards, but essentially this little plus shape at the top was quite a bit too tall and too big. So from left to right and up and down here, it was just too big to fit into the keycap. So I printed a few different variations. I came into Tinkercad, did some editing to kind of trim it down, and after probably 4 or 5 different versions, I got one that fit really, really well. 3D printers print from the bottom to the top and in layers. So what I did find ultimately was that it's a pretty tight fit, and I wanted it to be a pretty tight fit. The problem is that if I were to pull the keycaps off, there's a pretty decent chance I'm going to pull these layers apart. So in hindsight, I probably should have made this just a little bit looser or trimmed these dimensions down just a little bit more. With that, it would have probably survived a little bit longer, but nonetheless, it works really well the way it is now. I just put the little rubber contact piece back underneath from the broken plunger, and it works really well. It literally took 2 weeks to get the keycaps retrobrighted. I tried a variety of different combinations of light positions, different amounts of hydrogen peroxide cream, a lot of different things to get them back to a state which I thought they looked pretty good. So I was never able to get all of the keys to be perfect. There were certainly some that when put side by side to a non-yellowed key that you really couldn't tell the difference, and some of them you certainly could. However, they look significantly better than they did when we started. So I'm going to put this thing back together. I'll show you what the keyboard looks like. Right now, the top plastic shell is in Retrobright. I won't bore you with more pictures of that, but what I will do is I will show you the final product at the very end. So we'll get this keyboard put all back together, and I think you'll start to see how this is going to look. So, as a reminder, here's what the keyboard looked like right when we started, and here's what it looks like now. It'll look even better once we get it all put back together. The next step in restoring this computer is to make sure the electronics work as expected. Our initial tests were very positive. We didn't see anything blatantly wrong, but now it's time for a more thorough examination. So what I'm wiring up here is the Commodore test harness. So I've got a cartridge here with a couple different versions of the Commodore Dead Test software, and I'm installing all the connections for the test harness. So essentially what this does when I turn it on, it'll go through some testing. It'll test the user port, the cassette port, the serial or disk drive port, the keyboard, and the controllers. This is a pretty good way to tell if something's wrong. I've never really had a problem with it. I've had problems that it doesn't find on occasion, but for the most part, if it says something is bad, usually it is.
Now you'll see on this motherboard there's not a lot of things that are socketed. So other than the SID chip and the VIC chip, everything else is soldered onto the board. So if it does find anything, we're going to have to, remove those components and put some sockets on and things like that. The other thing to keep in mind is we were pulling quite a bit more amperage, more current than what I would have expected. So I think we're around 1.15. Typically I see these around the 0.8, 0.85. So I'm going to let this cartridge run a number of iterations of the testing, give everything time to warm up, and if something is going to fail, I want it to fail now while I've got it all apart and have a good opportunity to repair it. Okay, we'll fire up the dead test cartridge here and see what happens. When you first turn it on, it goes through and tests all the RAM in the machine, and then we'll run some tests on the other components, as you can see down there in the bottom. That's, for the most part, most of the major things. It'll also test a couple other components and pop up a message if it finds them to be faulty. And so hopefully we won't find anything like that. If you do any work on Commodore machines, highly recommend the cartridge here, along with the test harness. Makes finding problems much simpler, or at least most of the problems much simpler. So, okay, looks like we've got U1 and U2. Those are both CIA chips used for, used by the machine to talk to the control ports and the keyboard and things like that, along with 4066. That, if I remember correctly, is a memory multiplexer. Don't quote me on that. Not terribly surprised to see the CIA chips bad or listed as bad. Recall the higher current draw we were seeing. I would be surprised if it wasn't one or both of those chips causing that. And it probably, they worked well to begin with, and then after warming up for the first time in years, probably just failed. After replacing the 4066 chip, I went ahead and reran the dead test cartridge with the harness. What I started seeing then was a bunch of random or seemingly random memory chip errors and other failures. And so what I probably should have done was to go ahead and socket and replace the CIA chips. What I ended up doing was chasing those little gremlins. So I ended up replacing a couple of the memory chips, socketing the ROMs, doing some troubleshooting there. Finally, with the help of the oscilloscope, I was able to narrow the problem down to, you guessed it, the CIA chip. Had I just started there, I would have saved myself a whole lot of time. Anyway, I got everything back up and running with the exception of one final error, and the problem was the cartridge port. I couldn't get the cartridges other than the dead test cartridge. I couldn't get any other cartridge to work properly. As soon as I see a cartridge problem, that immediately rings PLA to me. The only problem was I didn't have any PLAs left in my spare parts to replace it. So let me show you what we did with that.
Anytime you see a bad or a cartridge that doesn't work, obviously clean the contacts is the first place to start. I did that. That wasn't doing it. Next place I look is the PLA. So there's been the project, the GAL PLA project, which is this right here. Put the link below. I've been following that. Looks like there's been some good results with it, so I went ahead and had some boards put together, programmed a couple gals that I had, and sure enough, works like a champ. So as soon as I replaced the PLA with the GAL PLA, the cartridges all started working again. So I'm going to call this one done. Everything has been replaced that needed to be replaced, perhaps a couple things that didn't need to be replaced. Screen looks good, plastic looks good. So I'm going to put this back together and then we'll do a comparison before and after, and we'll call it a wrap.
And just when I thought we were done, we were not quite done. The GAL-based PLA was actually sitting inside of a socket, and that turned out to be too tall for the keyboard to fit back down properly in the case. So I had to remove the socket and solder the GAL-based PLA onto the board, as you can see here.
And there we notice the current draw is much more in line with what I expected.
And we're done. So we got to test the limits of retrobrighting a bit, at least in my experience, and that was pretty fun. You can see the plastics don't quite match in color, and that's not quite perfect, but I'm not sure how much more I would be able to do with this, considering the condition it was in before. We also got to develop a 3D model of a keyboard plunger that worked flawlessly, and got to use the really cool GAL PLA project, which is something I've been wanting to do for a while, and I'm really excited about that because I've got a need for PLAs and several other machines that I'm working on. So I think it came out really nice. It looks really good. And just as a reminder, here's what it looked like before, and here's what it looks like now. At the end of the day, not too bad. And it's one more Commodore 64C that we saved from the junk pile. I hope everyone enjoyed this transformation of this Commodore 64C, and I hope you'll come hang out in the Commodore room again real soon. Thanks.